If you spend enough time on the internet, you'll run into apologists for some truly terrible people. For example, there are those who will say the so-called Confederacy was a noble bastion of Christian civilization that only sought to throw off the dictatorship that America had become. They will minimize slavery and declare Reconstruction a terrible mistake, rather than a brief period where racial equality and democracy flourished in the liberated South. And then there are the alleged experts of interwar and World War II Germany. The ones who will claim Hitler and the Nazis fixed the German economy in the 1930s, are responsible for major technological breakthroughs, or even that they tried to save the world from communism. Many of these people can be dismissed as far-right weirdos, but occasionally their ideas gain traction with the normies, such as the idea that the Nazis were ultimately a reaction to what came before it, an experiment in democracy that was so degenerate and mishandled that it convinced the German people to embrace fascism. But is this true? Hello everyone, I'm Matt Mitcherich, the alternate historian. So, let's talk about the Weimar Republic. Although officially called the German Reich, the Weimar Republic, or Weimar Germany, is a name given to the period from 1918 to 1933, when a united Germany was briefly a republic. It began at the tail end of World War I, with the German Revolution. With Germany heading toward defeat, soldiers began to mutiny, and they and German workers formed their own councils, similar to the Soviets that formed out east a year earlier. However, unlike the Russian Revolution, the German Revolution was a relatively moderate affair. Soldiers and workers' councils worked alongside existing bureaucrats to maintain order, and despite talks of socializing the economy, private property was respected. Monarchs like Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany and King Ludwig III of Bavaria abdicated rather than fight against the revolution. Meanwhile, socialist leaders worked with their more conservative colleagues to figure out the future of Germany. Unfortunately, radical leftists were unhappy with these developments and staged revolts in 1919, such as the Spartacus Uprising, or established breakaway states like the Bavarian Soviet Republic. While both of these were quickly defeated, they and news coming out of the Russian Civil War left many Germans fearful of Marxism, and thus filled the ranks of many pro-fascist organizations. Still, at the time, there was no reason to suspect Germany wouldn't become a republic like the capitalist democracies that won World War I. Thus, in 1919, German leaders drafted a new constitution in the town of Weimar, a city famous for being the center of the German Enlightenment, which would ultimately give the republic its name. Now, the new constitution turned Germany into a parliamentary democracy, with its legislature being the Reichstag. It would be led by a chancellor, who acted like the Prime Minister of Britain. They would be the leader of either the party or the coalition of parties, able to control 50% of the seats in the Reichstag. Meanwhile, Germany's head of state would be a president elected every 7 years in place of a monarch. The president would be mostly ceremonial, but would maintain one unique power that I will get into later. In addition, the Weimar Constitution had universal suffrage for all adults, including women, guaranteed the right to free speech and assembly, and enshrined the German welfare state. Which are all good things if you're not an overly online crazy person. However, the Weimar Constitution did have its flaws. For example, there was Article 48, which was probably adopted to appease conservatives' distrust of democracy, and also due to the fear of another Spartacus uprising happening. It stated, if public security and order are seriously disturbed or endangered within the German Reich, the President of the Reich may take measures necessary for their restoration, intervening if need be with the assistance of the armed forces. As you can probably guess, given its vague and broad wording, Article 48 was used many times by German presidents who ruled by decree. Additionally, the individual German states still had autonomy when it came to their local affairs, which is why the state of Bavaria became a haven for far-right organizations, including the Nazi Party, and it would be Bavarian judges who would go easy on Hitler after his failed beer hall putsch in 1923. Nevertheless, the Weimar Republic started out with the support of the vast majority of Germans, and because of that, the Republic could carry out many popular reforms. For example, the working class of Germany benefited from increased wages and a government more willing to work with their unions. But anti-democracy factions were still a threat. In addition to the far left hoping for a more Soviet-style revolution, conservatives also distrusted this new democracy and tended to retain the positions of authority in the military, bureaucracy, judiciary, and business they got back when the old Kaiser was in charge. Some of these people staged the infamous Kapp-Putsch of 1920, but the Republic survived. The end of World War I and the Versailles Treaty were also seen as a humiliation to most Germans. There was a persistent belief that the German army was stabbed in the back by Weimar Republicans, some of whom were Jewish, and that the resulting peace treaty, with its territorial losses, war guilt, and reparations, was unnecessarily harsh on Germany. Now, most of these beliefs are, in hindsight, unreasonable. I already pointed out in an earlier video how unlikely Germany could win World War I, even with the United States sitting it out. Furthermore, one could even make the argument that Germany could pay the reparations required of them, especially when compared to the cost of fighting and losing another world war, but convincing voters they should was an incredibly hard sell. Minister of Recovery Walter Rathenau did attempt to address the reparation issue early for the Weimar Republic, but he was assassinated by right-wing extremists in June 1922. To make matters worse for Weimar Germany, they inherited a poor post-war economy from Imperial Germany due to the Kaiser taking out a huge amount of debt to finance the war. Meanwhile, as wages and government spending increased, the German government compensated for this by printing more money, causing inflation to rise. Then, when it looked like Germany might not pay reparations, France and Belgium occupied the industrialized Ruhr region from 1922 to 1923. The German government tried to passively resist by ordering German workers there to go on strike, with the promise they'd pay their wages. In order to do this, the government printed even more money and thus created hyperinflation. This is when you get stories of people using wheelbarrows full of cash to buy a loaf of bread, and it made people resent the Weimar government and increased membership in far-left and far-right parties. And yet, despite all of these coup attempts and the bad economy, the Weimar Republic survived and thrived. In August 1923, Gustav Stresemann became Chancellor of Germany. He ended the Ruhr crisis by promising to restart payments on reparations and ordered striking workers to return to their jobs. Inflation was halted thanks to the adoption of a new currency, government spending was scaled back, and the economy recovered. From then onward, the Weimar Republic entered what some call a golden age. Wages rose, working conditions improved, and consumer spending increased. The Weimar government spent significant amounts of money on housing and education, which made city life attractive to many Germans. Even German women enjoyed new freedoms and economic opportunities, much to the chagrin of German conservatives. During this time, Germany was dominated by pro-democracy parties like the Social Democratic Party of Germany, SPD, the German People's Party, and the Center Party, who usually made up the coalitions that chose the chancellors and formed the cabinets during the Weimar years. There were other parties as well, one of the more significant ones being the Communist Party of Germany, whose short-sighted hatred of the more moderate SPD would lead to some of their members cooperating with the Nazis in an effort to break apart the Republic. Nevertheless, it would be this coalition of Republicans that would pursue a strategy of improving relations with the rest of the world, especially the United States. Thanks to their efforts, the US became a believer that reparations were a drain on the German economy and put pressure on the United Kingdom and France to renegotiate reparations. The ultimate outcome of this was the Dawes Plan of 1924, named after the American diplomat and later Vice President Charles Dawes, who helped set it up. Under it, Germany earned an easier repayment plan that also saw foreign troops leave the war. More importantly, Germany was able to obtain loans from the US, which in turn were used to pay war debts to Britain and France, who in turn paid back their debts to America. Although this system did help stabilize Germany's economy and improved relations between the former warring powers, it was incredibly fragile, as we will soon learn. However, it was the culture of Weimar Germany that truly shined during this period. Many works of Franz Kafka and the anti-war novel All Quiet on the Western Front by Erich Remarque were published during this era. Architectural styles like the Bauhaus school took form in Weimar Germany. This is also when film was being recognized as an art form, and German filmmakers were giving us works like Metropolis, Nosferatu, and The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, which are all still watched and studied to this day. Indeed, Hollywood and Broadway would benefit from Weimar filmmakers, composers, and actors who fled to America when the Nazis came to power. LGBTQ people also enjoyed a sort of kind of tolerance in Weimar Germany. Kaz Rowe goes deeper into this in their video, The Queer History of Weimar Germany, which I recommend you all check out for a deeper dive into the subject. But to summarize, while it wasn't exactly legal to be openly LGBTQ in Weimar Germany, you could find underground gay, lesbian, and trans clubs. LGBTQ publications were also distributed in cities like Berlin. Trans men and women could even get permits from the government to dress as the gender they identified as, and had limited abilities to change their name if they so choose. Weimar Germany also saw the founding of the Institute for Sexual Research in 1919 by Magnus Hirschfeld, which did many pioneering, if questionable, studies into gender and sexuality before much of their research was destroyed by the Nazis and one of their earliest book burnings. And while best known for the work they did for the LGBTQ community, the Institute also championed the use of contraceptives and better treatment for venereal diseases. Admittedly, we must acknowledge that this golden age was on a pretty shaky foundation. The Great Depression was just around the corner, and it would reinvigorate the Nazi Party. When the Depression hit, American capital dried up, and German loans suddenly became due, which crashed the German economy. The pro-democracy parties of Weimar were unable to come up with a solution to address the growing number of unemployed Germans. Conservatives thought the high cost of unemployment and other social services were preventing a recovery, while liberals and moderate leftists thought more money should be spent to help those suffering the worst under the Depression. Even then, many in the government were fearful of too much government spending, lest it reignite hyperinflation. Thus, in 1930, the Grand Coalition of the Weimar Republic collapsed, and the Reichstag became paralyzed, as no party could win enough votes to gain a majority or otherwise form a coalition government. With the Reichstag unable to function, power became wielded by the conservative and anti-democratic president Paul von Hindenburg, who invoked Article 48 many times to rule by decree. He also appointed a series of conservative chancellors who whittled away at the democratic framework of the Weimar government, while also doing little to address the impact of the Great Depression. Meanwhile, unemployed Germans flocked to the Nazi Party, and they became one of the largest parties in the Reichstag, although they still lacked the numbers to form a government on their own. Surprisingly, Germany might have been able to defeat the Nazis even at this late hour. By the fall of 1932, Nazi popularity had crested, as they lost a significant number of seats in what would be the last free election in Germany for some time. The Nazi Party was also deep in debt, and their members were questioning why their fascist seizure of Germany hadn't happened yet. Thus, the party was losing momentum, but it was ultimately saved by short-sighted conservatives who, in an effort to outmaneuver their rivals, would convince Hindenburg to appoint Hitler as chancellor in an effort to get Nazi support, but with every intention of using him as a puppet. A plan which, in hindsight, was truly naive and marked the end of the Weimar Republic and the start of Germany's descent into fascism, war, and genocide. Sadly, the Weimar Republic just lacked the time necessary to convince Germans that democracy was the way to go. But what if they had more time? Of course, the next question is, how do we give them that time? The obvious answer is to just kill or otherwise incapacitate Hitler so he doesn't become, well, Hitler. It is generally accepted that his leadership is responsible for the Nazi success, and so without him, one could argue the German far right wouldn't unify under a single banner. However, this smacks too much of the great man theory. I mean, it's not like Hitler invented nationalism, fascism, or anti-Semitism. Thus, by putting all the blame on one man, it sort of absolves the German people for what happened during World War II and the Holocaust. And such thinking just creates bad beliefs like the clean Wehrmacht or the "I was just following orders" defense for crimes against humanity. No, taking out one man is not a great point of divergence, so we'll need to find another one, even if some might think it's ultimately impossible. You see, per Gabriel Rosenfeld's 2005 book, The World Hitler Never Made, Alternate History and the Memory of Nazism, there are many alternate histories where Hitler never came to power, and the Weimar Republic still collapses, either because of a fascist or even a communist takeover. Indeed, it seems the consensus is that liberal democracy in early 20th century Germany was never going to last due to the structural problems inherent in the Weimar Republic. I, however, reject this idea, just as I reject the idea that Americans are somehow safe from dictatorship because of my country's long history of democracy. Germany has its own democratic history. The Germans produced many great thinkers during the Age of Enlightenment, like Immanuel Kant, Johann Wolfgang von Goethe, and Alexander von Humboldt. Many Germans participated in the revolutions of 1848. The Reichstag itself was founded in 1866, and before that could trace its legacy back to the imperial diet of the Holy Roman Empire. Sure, nationalism and racism are there, but ideas like freedom and democracy are there as well, and we should stop acting like they are inherently the weaker force. What I'm saying is, it can happen here, can apply to democracy as well. And even in the midst of the Great Depression, I still think the Weimar Republic had a shot at surviving. If the pro-Republic political parties can come up with some kind of compromise in 1930 to address the Great Depression, a German New Deal as it were, they could have avoided the Reichstag being paralyzed and keep democracy alive. And if this compromise involved public work programs that help address high unemployment, especially in those areas likely to vote for the Nazis, then it might blunt their rise in popularity following the Great Depression. But to truly save the Weimar Republic, we need to get rid of Hindenburg so we can't screw things up later. But who should we get to replace him? Let me introduce you to Hugo Echner. He was an airship pioneer who became obsessed with them after seeing Count Ferdinand von Zeppelin's first airship in 1900. Not only was he deeply involved in their construction and operation, but he even captained them. Following Germany's defeat in World War I, Echner was instrumental in keeping the Zeppelin company alive by building and then piloting what would become the airship USS Los Angeles across the Atlantic. Further exploits with the Graf Zeppelin, including the first circumnavigation of the globe by airship, brought Echner international fame, and he became a celebrity hero in both Germany and the rest of the world. Meanwhile, his Zeppelin company was making some of the first transatlantic passenger flights to Brazil and the United States. His fame almost led him into politics, as both the SPD and Center parties floated the idea of him running for president in the 1932 election, but when Hindenburg decided to run again, he ultimately stuck with his Zeppelins. After the Nazis came to power, he publicly criticized the new regime and refused to let them use his airships for propaganda purposes. Unfortunately, there wasn't much he could do to stop them, since the German government, now controlled by the Nazis, was also an owner of the Zeppelin company. Echner was thus fired as the head of the Zeppelin company and prevented from ever commanding an airship. Still, Echner outlasted the Nazi regime, even though it meant witnessing the end of the golden age of airships. But in this alternate timeline, where parliamentary democracy does not collapse, what if Echner ran for president in 1932? Other alternate historians have suggested it before, such as James L. Cambias's 2004 short story, The Echner Alternative, and Zach Anderson's web original, The Airship President, which was published between 2009 and 2011, both of which I will link to below so you can check them out for yourself. And Hindenburg may not have run again as president in 1932, given that he was already in his 80s and would only be 2 years from his death in our timeline. So perhaps Hindenburg declines to run again, and the pro-democracy party successfully pressure Echner to run. The famous airship captain defeats Hitler, and Weimar Germany is slightly safer now that they have an anti-Nazi president. Also, as an alternate historian, there is something poetic about an airship captain saving democracy from the Nazis. And what about Hitler and the Nazis? Well, we know they would be losing momentum at this point, and without anti-democratic conservatives in power, there would be no invitation to become chancellor. A desperate Hitler might try for another push, but like the earlier beer hall push, this one fails as well. However, it's far larger and more violent, which freaks out your average German citizen. Thus, Echner uses Article 48 of the Weimar Constitution to truly bring the hammer down on Hitler and the Nazis. For their role in the coup, Hitler and many Nazi leaders are executed for treason. Other prominent Nazis are imprisoned or else flee to sympathetic countries like Italy, while the rank-and-file members quietly burn their brown shirts. Ultimately, this act saves the Weimar Republic, and Germany continues on without the Nazis. So, what happens next? Well, the defeat of the Nazis would probably be the end of the far-right in Germany for some time, and other anti-Weimar politicians would probably moderate their criticisms of the Republic lest they be accused of having Nazi sympathies. Thus, the coalition of democratic parties would continue to hold the Republic together through the rest of the Great Depression, and they may even get help from Britain and France. We know that in our timeline, shortly before the Nazi takeover, France offered to cooperate economically with Germany in order to help them pay their debts, but the increasingly right-wing Germany rejected this offer. In this alternate timeline, however, the still functioning Weimar Republic accepts the offer, and together with the UK, again renegotiate their reparations payments while also agreeing to cooperate economically in an early form of European integration that draws in other European countries as well, especially in Eastern Europe, as I will discuss more later. With the economy improving throughout the 1930s, any opposition to the Weimar Republic becomes increasingly fringe, and Germany does not suffer the cultural stagnation and brain drain that Nazi Germany experienced. The Nazi-backed Ahnenerbe is never formed, and thus they do not attempt to argue that some ancient white-skinned, blue-eyed Aryan civilization was responsible for all significant developments in human history. While their ideas were rejected by the vast majority of serious historians and archaeologists, even today they are popular in far-right circles and influence pseudo-archaeologists of the Graham-Hancock variety. But if Weimar survive, their ideas may never get such international recognition, which unfortunately means no Indiana Jones punching Nazis. Meanwhile, many German artists would not have fled Europe for America, and Berlin would continue to be a major center for art, literature, plays, and film. Indeed, we may even see works of literature published in this alternate timeline that have been lost in ours. For example, in our timeline, some unpublished Kafka works were lost when they were confiscated by the Nazis, but in this alternate timeline, they'd likely be published. And what about Hirschfeld and the Institute for Sexual Research? Well, since it wouldn't be destroyed by the Nazis in this alternate timeline, he and others like him would continue their research into sexuality and gender uninterrupted. Friend of the channel, Sean McKnight, has even argued in a 2023 article that if the Institute survived, It would become a haven for sexology researchers from around the world, and if conservative Germans still tried to shutter it, it could kick off protests by Berlin's queer community, sort of like the 1969 Stonewall riots of our timeline, thus touching off an earlier gay rights movement. Additionally, perhaps gender-affirming healthcare, including for children, would not be so controversial by the present day, and AIDS may not have become an epidemic if the Institute continued its research into sexually transmitted infections. And this alternate Weimar Germany would also benefit from various technological achievements. For example, when the Nazis came to power, many physicists fled Europe, and their work proved incredibly beneficial to the United States and its Manhattan Project. But in this alternate timeline, Albert Einstein, John von Neumann, Leo Szilard, James Franck, Edward Teller, Klaus Fuchs, Enrico Fermi, and others would have stayed behind in Europe, and thus their future scientific discoveries would directly benefit a democratic Germany and its European allies. And even the German rocket scientist Werner von Braun was working on his rockets before the Nazis came to power. Thus, even in a timeline where the Weimar Republic still stands, I could easily see the Reichswehr, aka the Weimar military, realizing the benefit of being able to strike any future enemy from afar, and thus fund his experiments, leading to larger and better rockets that might ultimately lead to Germany being the first to put a satellite and even a human in space. And yeah, with the biggest airship fanboy as president of Germany, and no Nazis to screw with the Zeppelin company, the golden age of airships might last just a little longer. You see, our boy Echner was extremely risk-averse when it came to his airships, and stressed safety over everything else. But when the Nazis sidelined him, the people who took over were not as cautious, especially with the new airship, the Hindenburg. But in this Nazi-less alternate timeline, the Hindenburg is more likely to have safe landings, especially if the US becomes less stingy with sharing its helium reserves with the rest of the world, which is something they considered doing in our timeline after the Hindenburg disaster. Thus, luxury airships continued to take people across the continents until eventually being replaced by commercial airplanes. Of course, this assumes that everything stays peaceful for Weimar Germany, but would the rest of the world leave them alone? A common threat to a Nazi-less Germany is the Soviet Union. Indeed, a good example is Norman Spinrad's 1972 novel, The Iron Dream, where Hitler goes to America to become a science fiction writer, and Germany experiences a communist revolution, which allows the Soviet Union to expand across much of the world. So perhaps there would be a World War II in this alternate timeline, but instead caused by the Soviets. Or maybe not. As Sebastian Roblin pointed out in his 2020 article for the National Interest, Stalin liked to pick on smaller countries that lacked powerful allies. So occupying the Baltic nations or demanding Bessarabia from Romania are still plausible, but a general invasion of Europe? Unlikely, and sounds too much like the theory championed by those on the far right that believe Stalin wanted to invade Europe in 1941, and thus Hitler's invasion in our timeline could be seen as a preemptive strike. Obviously, serious World War II historians reject this theory. Still, in this alternate timeline, Russian territorial demands in Eastern Europe during the late 1930s and early 1940s caused the UK and France, already going closer with Weimar Germany due to their economic cooperation, to consent to German rearmament. Ironically, thanks to the Soviets letting the German military test out new equipment and tactics during the 1920s in their territory to get around the Versailles restrictions, the German military has a good foundation to rebuild from. Plus, the rockets von Braun's team are developing look extremely promising. With an alliance of European states led by the UK, France, and Germany pledging to defend places like Poland and Finland should the Soviets invade, Stalin backs down, but the threat doesn't go away completely. But one outcome of this crisis is that the European states continue to integrate, perhaps even kicking off an earlier version of the European Union. And maybe the first major project of this alternate EU is to investigate suggestions by some German physicists about the feasibility of atomic weaponry. But the Soviets aren't the only threat to world peace. Which brings us to Japan. Now, when it comes to Japan in World War II, a lot of people only know about the attack on Pearl Harbor and the nuclear bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. But in our timeline, during this era, Japan was a militaristic and imperialistic state ready and willing to invade its neighbors. So expect the Second Sino-Japanese War to still break out with China in 1937, which might still end up in a stalemate by 1939. Now, in our timeline, Japan took advantage of the war in Europe to occupy French Indochina, following the surrender of France in 1940, which in turn would trigger an American embargo on oil to Japan. Because of this, Japanese leaders came up with a plan to seize the resource-rich East Asian colonies of the British and Dutch. After attacking the American fleet at Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, Japan quickly occupied these regions in hope that they could make the cost of retaking them so high that America and their allies would instead negotiate a peace. They were, of course, Wrong. But in this alternate timeline, there'd be no war in Europe, and so Japan would never occupy French Indochina, and thus not trigger the American embargo. So Japan would lack a major reason for kicking off a larger war in the Pacific, and if they still tried to, they'd be facing the full might of the US, the European colonial powers, and perhaps even the Soviet Union, who might want to invade Japanese-occupied Manchuria. So unless the Japanese leadership was truly insane, which, let's be honest, is always a possibility, they might instead negotiate a peace with China when the war stalemated. So the Second Sino-Japanese War would end with Japan gaining some territory at the expense of China while still keeping their fascist government. Meanwhile, nationalist China might try to finish off the communists and other warlords, but that process might take years and would still leave places like Tibet and the East Turkestan Republic independent. But we should remember something important. A world where the Weimar Republic survives is a world where the Holocaust didn't happen. Sure, Weimar Germany had its fair share of anti-Semitism, but I doubt this is a timeline where the death camps would be built. Millions of Jewish Europeans would not be slaughtered simply because of their religion. What their lives would be like, I could hardly guess, but I have to believe it's better for humanity to avoid the Holocaust. That said, what would this mean for Israel? Zionism had already encouraged Jews to migrate to Palestine in the early 20th century, but without the Nazis or the Holocaust, there may not be enough settlers to form our timeline's Israel. So either there is an autonomous Jewish zone in Arab-majority Palestine, or it's a much smaller state, as seen in Michael Brenner's 2016 short story, What If the Weimar Republic Had Survived? A chapter from Walter Mathenau's memoir. Well, I think it's finally time to wrap this sucker up. In my humble opinion, the Weimar Republic was a flawed but promising democracy for Germany. It allowed for artists and innovators to thrive, and if given more time, it may have turned Germany into an economic, cultural, and scientific powerhouse. It could have been a place that learned to become tolerant of their neighbors, even if they had a different religion or were LGBTQ. Finally, it would have prevented the world from experiencing the horrors of another world war and the genocide that went with it. And if we want to avoid repeating the mistakes of Weimar Germany, well, people who believe in democracy should not become so blind to the threat of fascism that they get distracted by fighting amongst themselves. Conservatives and the far left also need to ditch the idea there is any benefit in aligning themselves with fascists for short-term gain. This is because fascism is a destructive ideology that hampers human ingenuity and progress. Thus, if we can sum up the lesson of the Weimar Republic, it is that we should always stand united in the face of fascism, and together stamp it out before it drags humanity back into another era of darkness. Well, that's all I have to say on the subject. If you enjoy what I do, please like, comment, subscribe, click that bell icon, share this video, or support me on Patreon. I'm Matt Mitrich, the Alternate Historian. Bye.